rest of your organization is totally secure, if you're relying on a vendor product with a flaw, then it can be game over. So, Matt, tell us what we're looking at. This was from an internal penetration test, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So this is an internal penetration test that our team did. And they were able to get access to the administrative interface for a piece of software called Power Panel. If you're not familiar with Power Panel, it is responsible for managing things like battery backup systems and other like Internet of Things style devices that are responsible for power management inside of your network. But it can also link into the rest of your network. It is, in fact, a device that can be used to communicate with your domain controller or communicate with other computers on the network. And it kind of has to function properly. What you're looking at here is the administrative login interface, and you'll notice that we have two very simple elements on the screen. We have account and we have password. The idea is that this piece of software is meant to default to just a standard local system login when you access the actual system itself. But we can alter that, and our team was actually pretty clever in how they went about doing this. So this is us just going into the page source code. You can just right click on the web page and click inspect source, or you can press F12 to view it. This is showing us what all of the little elements of this page code look like. And if we look where the arrow is pointing, you can see that the list index we're looking at says don't display a list. But there is an option there that we can use LDAP. And if you're not familiar with LDAP, that means Lightweight Domain Access Protocol. This is what you would use to communicate with your domain controller and get usernames and passwords. Very, very simple protocol that a lot of people use. So what happens if we change that? What happens if we allow ourselves to now actually select other kinds of logins from that overall interface? And so we did just that. We set it to display those different kinds of systems. And now if we select something like LDAP, which this system is not configured for, here's where we find the flaw. By attempting to log in, that username and password that we have sitting there will not work because it's not the right kind of username and password, and it's not actually the right username and password at all. But in this case, it didn't matter. Due to a flaw in the actual software itself, it did what was called failing openly. And that means that it failed to log us in because that wasn't configured, but by failing to log us in, it actually just logged us in. So we didn't actually have to have a username and password. All we had to do was change that one little item, and now we are into the full administrative panel of this device. This is easy mode when it comes to us breaking into something like this on a network. And now we have access to everything that that device has access to. What you see here is just a screenshot. This is the administrative interface. You can see that we are in there as the admin user. So let's see what else we can do with this kind of access.
And this is pretty common where hackers will get a foothold into something that seems innocuous. Our team loves printers, for example. We'll get a foothold in the printer. And we've even seen that leading to like full takeover of their AWS infrastructure. It's kind of crazy. So here, our ethical hackers at LMG now have a foothold into this odd little product called Power Panel Enterprise. So let's see how they use that to level up and gain more privilege and more access. So what are they trying to get here, Matt? Let's understand the goal.
So the goal here is to get ourselves a persistent foothold in the network, and we want to do that getting shell access to something. And shell access just means that we have a command prompt that we can use to run our own commands inside of the environment that we're looking at. And as it turned out, this was easier than we thought it would be. So we found a system that we now had access to that was allowing us to set up things like backup storage for the Power Panel itself. And what we realized was that in things like that storage path, the little fields that they have available, they're not actually really checking what exact information is being loaded into those fields. So instead of just putting in something like the example where we specify an IP address and we specify a folder that we're going to look into, we can actually put a command in there. And so that's what we did. We modified it just a little bit to send a PowerShell command into that actual field, and then we went ahead and hit save and test. And when it tried to test that, it executed that PowerShell command on the network. Now that PowerShell command, and this is where our sneaky pen test team really shines, they had gone ahead and set up another repository, and they had what's called a reverse shell ready to go. And you can see it's down there at the bottom. It's called tomshell.ps1. That's a PowerShell script that's just going to open up that reverse shell for us. Now we have full access to this network, and we can run any command that we want to that would normally run in Windows. So let's think about what we could do with that kind of access. We could execute any code we want to. We can create new users, which was the next step that we actually did in this case. We can change network configurations. We can move to other computer systems. We can do what the hackers would do, steal data, install malware. I mean, the world is our oyster at this point, all because of a simple flaw in what most people probably thought was a pretty innocuous product on that network.
So this was obviously a product vulnerability. And I think a lot of people think, well, that's just one specific product, no big deal. We need to just do vendor vetting and hire vendors that don't have vulnerabilities. But let's face it, all products have vulnerabilities. We have this recommendation to do attack surface monitoring throughout our industry. Monitor your attack surface. Make sure you're checking for vulnerabilities. The problem is we are seeing so many zero-day vulnerabilities that people don't know about that you have to assume that every product is vulnerable. It's just a vulnerability may not have been discovered yet or may not have been announced. So we recommend, number one, minimize your attack surface. The less you have exposed, the better. If you can segment your network so fewer things are available on different segments, then that's obviously ideal. And then if you do vulnerability scanning, it may take months, even after a vulnerability is announced, before you can detect it with automated scanners. So this is a chart that Microsoft has put out. When a patch is released and a vulnerability is publicly disclosed, on average, they see exploitation in the wild within 14 days. Matt, how do you feel about 14 days? Is that, I don't know about you, we often see exploitation within hours, correct?
No, sometimes even minutes. Yeah, 14 days is a lifetime.
Yeah, and some hackers already know about these zero-day vulns and are ready and will ramp up before you've patched. Within 60 days, proof of concept code gets released on GitHub, but your your scanning software may still not be able to detect it. Finally, 120 days after a vulnerability is publicly disclosed, on average, vulnerability scanning software is able to detect that vulnerability reliably so that you're aware of it and you can fix it. So that means we have months between the time a vulnerability is publicly disclosed and the time that you may know about it. And obviously, high-profile issues are fast-tracked by your vulnerability scanning vendors, but they can't fast-track everything, and that's the problem. So that's why we do penetration testing. And when you do pen testing, it's really important to make sure you're including your vendor products in that as well, because it may be that your specific configuration or your patch level or however it's set up on your network could have introduced some additional vulnerabilities as well. So what can the vendor do in cases like this? Obviously, the vendor should have it tested as well. And often, LMG, we also do testing for vendors, and typically when we do that, we provide a letter of attestation that they can show customers. So I want to make sure everybody knows that, because you can ask to see a summary of pen test results, or just ask for verification that they're doing penetration testing on a regular basis. You want to have that app tested. And just in general, you want to make sure your vendor doesn't have default passwords. That comes up all the time. Doesn't allow modifications to the login menus like we saw in this case. And above all, doesn't rely on security through obscurity, because people will view source and figure it out. And if people don't, artificial intelligence will. We'll get to that soon. Another thing you want to think about is including emergency patching in your incident response plans. If this were public facing, you would want to take it down. And if you can't take it down, you want to patch it ASAP or put in other compensating controls. And the problem is, as we've seen time and time again, that the emergency patch you need may not even exist yet. Like the vendor may not have yet released it. Or if they have released it, it may not solve the whole problem. It may not be very well tested. So you need to expect multiple updates. These are conversations that should happen in advance. Make sure you and your team both know if you're going to be an early adopter of a patch. Make sure you understand if the people who are monitoring your network on the weekends or responding to incidents even have the ability to apply an emergency patch. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, this is Sherry Davidoff, CEO of LMG Security.
And I'm Matt Duran, Director of Training and Research for LMG Security. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out at any time. We would love to hear from you. You can reach us at info@lmgsecurity.com, find us on LinkedIn, or follow us on Twitter. Thanks again for joining, and we'll see you next time.